Okay, so I'm very pleased to speak to you today about understanding the opportunities and limitations of technology to support older people during the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland. My name is Louise McCabe. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Stirling, and this paper is co-authored by my colleagues Nereide, Alison, Elaine and Nessa. So we know that during the pandemic, life was particularly difficult for older people. We know that the restrictions imposed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic often posed significant risks to the human rights of older people. These responses are things like curfews and lockdowns and limitations to accessing community services. So the responses led to limitations in how people are able to engage with their family, with their community and with their cultural lives. We saw an increase in ageism through the conceptualisation of COVID-19 as a disease of the old, and we saw responses, social media hashtags like boomer remover, and quite high profile in terms of how ageism was seen within the media. And we also saw an increased risk of loneliness and social isolation, mainly linked to curfews and lockdowns. So is technology the solution? Is this what is going to help? So some work that we did prior to the pandemic showed that there was a connection between people who used social networking sites and people who were highly socially connected. But what we didn't know was whether that was a causal link, whether people who were socially connected were more likely to use networking sites, or whether the use of the technology actually increased people's social connections. But we do know from research during the pandemic that people that had prior knowledge of using social networking sites helped them to feel more socially included, and that access to social networking sites and other digital services was valued during the pandemic. We must be cognizant of the barriers and limitations in using technology. Digital poverty, digital literacy, hardware compatibility and user accessibility are just some of the challenges that need to be addressed if we are to really use technology in a very broad sense, in a very general sense for older people. But we must always be aware of the risks to the human rights of older people inherent in older people's ability to access and use technology, but also in the stereotypical assumptions and ageism that older people face that may limit their engagement due to other people not engaging with them or their own ideas of self-efficacy. So the project I'd like to talk about today was a qualitative piece of work that we did during the pandemic. And we did 24 interviews with older people living in Scotland. 4 were on the telephone with people who were not regular users of technology, and 20 were undertaken through group interviews on Zoom. We collected demographic interview data about our participants. We transcribed the interviews and we did a thematic analysis using NVivo. And then we pulled out what we thought were the key themes about the project. So this just shows where our participants were located in Scotland, so quite predominantly in the Central Belt, but we did have engagement for people living in quite rural and remote areas across Scotland. People ranged in age from 60 through to over 90, but the majority of our participants were 70 to 79. We had more women involved than men. A very ethnically non-diverse sample, actually reflecting wider populations in Scotland, but Very few people joined us from minority groups. Broad range of religious backgrounds and a range of educational backgrounds. We were interested in people from areas of differing deprivation, and as you can see, our sample had a very varied mix of people living in different parts of Scotland according to deprivation levels. Majority of people taking part lived with a partner or spouse. Very few lived with their children or grandchildren, and around a third lived alone. So these are older people who are living as a couple or on their own predominantly through the pandemic. Interestingly, their self-rates of quality of life were quite high, so over half chose a maximum response for their quality of life, and they all chose, either fairly good or good. So, and 82% of the sample had access to the internet, and 4 didn't. So we had, as you can see, a fairly varied sample that looked similar to the wider population of Scotland. People who live with their spouse or alone, but coming from a range of different types of area, mostly rating good quality of life, and most with access to the internet. But interestingly, we managed to talk to 4 people who really didn't use technology. So we talked to people about their lives before the pandemic, and what was really clear is that people were engaged in busy lives, lots of things going on. This first quote, somebody on a Monday goes to an art class, Tuesday a knitting group, Wednesday to dancing, swimming on a Monday as well. So just really busy lives. People were engaged in all sorts of social activities. So the limitations of the pandemic were really quite significant, because access to many of these activities would have been curtailed very suddenly as the pandemic started. So the data that we collected during the pandemic, it showed that people had continuing and changing relationships. So people were no longer able to meet people in person, or certainly weren't for a very long time. And when they were able to meet, often it was outside. But what we saw were people were starting obviously to use the phone, to use technology to stay connected, but often their social interaction was increasing. So the first quote, somebody's sister who lives in a different country had actually started to phone every week, and that's come as a result of the pandemic. We didn't do that before. Another one started phoning their friends a lot more than they used to. But then the third quote here is somebody that really felt very isolated. Everything in the community has stopped, and because I'm not doing Zoom, I'm not partaking in any meetings, the social life in here is non-existent. So it shows that those people that were engaged using the telephone or Zoom were able to continue and increase social contact, but for people who were resistant or unable to access technology, things were more difficult. For many of the people we spoke to, the pandemic had been a period of decline and disconnection. People missing out on creative activities in groups, not able to do exercise, no access to swimming. So here I am, a stone heavier, antisocial, and trying now to find my way out of this. And then 2 quotes about people becoming their mental health suffering through the pandemic, and for a person with dementia becoming more forgetful and the dementia progressing in a more notable way through the pandemic. But countering those stories of difficulty and decline, we found that older people were incredibly resourceful. So they were able to access a whole range of resources for change, or resources just to help them cope. These resources were sometimes internal, so they would be about an individual's resilience or character. They might be relational. This top one I like. My husband's retired and we had each other. I've also found out they actually get on quite well with my husband, and I quite enjoy his company. And others trying out Zoom and helping each other out, practicing using Zoom, and then they all join in with the group. And for others, they've got home-based activities, digging the garden, but also joining lots of new groups. This is a person living with dementia, but they've been started to do volunteering and coming onto Zoom conferences like the research. So taking up new opportunities that become available through the pandemic. It was very clear that people were using technology. So this one, somebody's used to run a current affairs group. They met on a Monday. It's taken a bit of time, but they've stuck with it, and now they've got a Zoom, an online version of the meeting with up to 12 people. And then somebody's saying that their social activity has increased 100-fold because they're able to connect and be part of different activities on Zoom. Zoom seemed to be the video conferencing application that people were most comfortable using. These are more examples of adopting technology, but also taking it forward with them. So somebody discussing going to an art class, and it was difficult to go because they had to go on the bus with all their materials. And they're saying, whereas on the Zoom, I've actually said it's almost like having your own personal tutor zoomed into your house for the afternoon. And then, that's a similar one about practicing and using Zoom. And then people having been connecting into much larger groups. So some older people spoke to us about small local groups that had now become much bigger international groups because they were able to link to other groups around the country and in other countries. So Zoom and technology really opening up social networks and broadening these out. The older people we spoke to were really positive, and they wanted to share their experiences, and they wanted to encourage other people to use technology. But they're saying, we need education, we need some classes to help with that. We need non-threatening social opportunities, the ability to upskill in small bites. But it was really positive, and they were engaging with the technology, and they were keen to keep using it. But they were aware that it's important to have accessible training opportunities to allow them to upskill, to gain digital literacy skills. So just to conclude, people with dementia and older people more generally are enthusiastic to use technologies, but we need to be participatory and responsive, and we need to think about a rights-based approach. Experiences and risks of loneliness and social isolation for older people will continue to need action and attention. And there are specific challenges around supporting older people to stay socially connected during times like the pandemic. It's vitally important to keep people with dementia and older people socially connected. And now that the initial rush precipitated by the pandemic to get online has passed, it's time, I think, for further reflection about how we sustain meaningful social connection for older people and how technology plays a role within that. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, my email address is below. And this web link here will take you to more information and a set of guidance that we've developed around the use of technology to support social connectedness for older people. Thank you very much for listening.